On the cold morning of October 13, 1399, the bells of Westminster Abbey tolled through a mist that clung low over the Thames. Inside the ancient abbey, beneath the dim flicker of candlelight, Henry Bolingbroke, once a banished noble, now cloaked in royal crimson, was crowned King Henry IV of England. The chant of priests echoed against the vaulted ceiling, and for a moment all of England seemed to hold its breath. The man who had entered exile as a political outcast had returned not merely to reclaim his rights, but to take a crown. The coronation was more than ceremony. It was the closing act of a year that had torn England's monarchy apart. Henry's rise had been swift, audacious, and, to some, divinely ordained. Only months earlier, he had been a fugitive in France, stripped of his inheritance and cut off from the realm of his birth. Yet now, by force of will and a tide of noble support, he stood where kings are anointed. The man he had deposed, Richard II, was no stranger to turbulence. Born in 1367, Richard had ascended the throne as a child of 10. A boy king molded by courtiers and constrained by the ambitions of others. As he came of age, his reign slid from promise into paranoia. Richard ruled not by consensus, but by conviction, believing himself divinely appointed and therefore beyond reproach. The nobility, however, saw arrogance where he claimed divine right. His policies and punishments alienated much of England's political class. For years, Richard had survived plots and discontent. His crown balanced precariously upon the edge of noble patience. But by 1399, that balance finally tipped. When John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Richard's uncle and Henry's father, died in February of that year, Richard made a fatal error. Instead of allowing Henry to inherit his father's estates, as was his legal right, the king seized the vast Lancastrian lands for himself. Those estates were no mere properties. They were a kingdom within a kingdom, stretching across Lancashire, Cheshire, Derbyshire, and beyond. By denying Henry his inheritance, Richard not only deprived a man of his birthright, but also antagonized every noble who feared that their own holdings could be taken next. When Richard sailed for Ireland in the summer of 1399, seeking to suppress a rebellion there, Henry saw his chance. With quiet resolve, he crossed the Channel and landed on the English coast. What began as a personal mission to reclaim his patrimony soon evolved into a movement to reclaim the kingdom itself. One by one, the lords of England turned against their absent monarch. Henry's banner, marked by the red rose of Lancaster, became a rallying point for discontent. The nobility, weary of Richard's erratic governance, welcomed Bolingbroke not merely as a claimant to lands, but as a restorer of order. When Richard returned from Ireland, he found a realm already lost. His castles opened their gates to Henry's men. His allies melted away like mist before the dawn. He was captured without a decisive battle, his fate sealed not by swords, but by silence, the quiet betrayal of those who had once called him king. A year later, in captivity at Pontefract Castle, Richard II died, starved, it was whispered, by command of the new regime. Whether by design or neglect, his death marked the birth of a new dynasty, the House of Lancaster. Henry's seizure of the crown in 1399 transformed the political landscape of England. It was the first time since the Norman conquest that a reigning monarch had been successfully deposed and replaced by a subject. The event would reverberate across generations, planting the seeds of suspicion and legitimacy that would later bloom into the blood-soaked conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. The new king, Henry IV, inherited not peace, but a fragile realm. His throne was born of rebellion, and rebellion rarely grants stability. The Lancastrian dynasty took its name from the Duchy of Lancaster, that great northern power base built by Henry's father, John of Gaunt. But its roots stretch deep into the tangled soil of English history. back through centuries of conquest, loyalty, and defiance. The Duchy of Lancaster, from which Henry drew both his title and legitimacy, was unlike any other holding in the realm. Its lands were scattered across the north: Lancashire, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, Yorkshire, a rough, rain-swept frontier that had long been the crucible of English conflict. Centuries earlier, these lands had been the battleground between Anglo-Saxons and Viking raiders, then between Norman lords and rebellious northerners who defied rule from the south. Even after the Norman conquest, the north remained restless. From the time of William the Conqueror, power in England had always been a balancing act between the king and his great lords. The duchy that would one day bear the name Lancaster was originally entrusted to Norman nobles as a bulwark, a fortress realm meant to hold England together. Yet, as history would show, those same northern lords often became the ones who tested the crown's strength. The man he had deposed, Richard II, was no stranger to turbulence. Born in 1367, Richard had ascended the throne as a child of 10, a boy king molded by courtiers and constrained by the ambitions of others. As he came of age, his reign slid from promise into paranoia. Richard ruled not by consensus, but by conviction, believing himself divinely appointed and therefore beyond reproach. The nobility, however, saw arrogance where he claimed divine right. His policies and punishments alienated much of England's political class. For years, Richard had survived plots and discontent, his crown balanced precariously upon the edge of noble patience. But by 1399, that balance finally tipped. When John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Richard's uncle and Henry's father, died in February of that year, Richard made a fatal error. Instead of allowing Henry to inherit his father's estates, as was his legal right, the king seized the vast Lancastrian lands for himself. Those estates were no mere properties. They were a kingdom within a kingdom, stretching across Lancashire, Cheshire, Derbyshire, and beyond. By denying Henry his inheritance, Richard not only deprived a man of his birthright, but also antagonized every noble who feared that their own holdings could be taken next. When Richard sailed for Ireland in the summer of 1399, seeking to suppress a rebellion there, Henry saw his chance. With quiet resolve, he crossed the Channel and landed on the English coast. What began as a personal mission to reclaim his patrimony soon evolved into a movement to reclaim the kingdom itself. One by one, the lords of England turned against their absent monarch. Henry's banner, marked by the red rose of Lancaster, became a rallying point for discontent. The nobility, weary of Richard's erratic governance, welcomed Bolingbroke not merely as a claimant to lands, but as a restorer of order. When Richard returned from Ireland, he found a realm already lost. His castles opened their gates to Henry's men. His allies melted away like mist before the dawn. He was captured without a decisive battle, his fate sealed not by swords, but by silence. The quiet betrayal of those who had once called him king. A year later, in captivity at Pontefract Castle, Richard II died. Starved, it was whispered, by command of the new regime. Whether by design or neglect, his death marked the birth of a new dynasty, the House of Lancaster. Henry's seizure of the crown in 1399 transformed the political landscape of England. It was the first time since the Norman conquest that a reigning monarch had been successfully deposed and replaced by a subject. The event would reverberate across generations, planting the seeds of suspicion and legitimacy that would later bloom into the blood-soaked conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. The new king, Henry IV, inherited not peace but a fragile realm. His throne was born of rebellion, and rebellion rarely grants stability. The Lancastrian dynasty took its name from the Duchy of Lancaster, that great northern power base built by Henry's father, John of Gaunt. But its roots stretch deep into the tangled soil of English history, back through centuries of conquest, loyalty, and defiance. The Duchy of Lancaster, from which Henry drew both his title and legitimacy, was unlike any other holding in the realm. Its lands were scattered across the north, Lancashire, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, Yorkshire, a rough, rain-swept frontier that had long been the crucible of English conflict. Centuries earlier, these lands had been the battleground between Anglo-Saxons and Viking raiders, then between Norman lords and rebellious northerners who defied rule from the south. Even after the Norman conquest, the north remained restless. From the time of William the Conqueror, power in England had always been a balancing act between the king and his great lords. The duchy that would one day bear the name Lancaster was originally entrusted to Norman nobles as a bulwark, a fortress realm meant to hold England together. Yet, as history would show, those same northern lords, when King Edward III ascended to the English throne in 1327, few could have foreseen that his sprawling family, 13 children, 8 sons, and 5 daughters, would one day ignite one of the bloodiest dynastic struggles in English history. His reign, which stretched for half a century, marked both the apex of English medieval power and the beginning of its unraveling. Among Edward's sons, one would become legendary, another forgotten, and one, John of Gaunt, would shape the destiny of kings without ever wearing a crown himself. John was born in 1340, the very year his father first claimed the French throne and launched the epic struggle known as the 100 Years' War. He grew up amid the clang of arms and the smoke of ambition, a prince bred for empire. His birthplace, Ghent in Flanders, then called Gaunt in English, would lend him the name by which history remembers him. By rights of birth, John was only the third surviving son of the king, outranked by his elder brothers, Edward, the Black Prince, and Lionel, Duke of Clarence. Yet fate has its own mathematics, and John's marriage would elevate him far beyond the ordinary reach of a younger son. In 1359, at the age of 19, he married Blanche of Lancaster, the 17-year-old daughter and heiress of Henry, Duke of Lancaster, one of the richest men in England and among its most powerful. It was a union that blended royal blood with vast estates, political influence, and near-feudal autonomy. 2 years later, Blanche's father died, leaving no male heir. Through her, John inherited not only the title Duke of Lancaster, but also the immense Duchy of Lancaster, a domain so large and wealthy it could rival the crown itself. By 1362, Edward III confirmed the transfer, and John's new holdings stretched across the north and Midlands of England, from the rugged lands of Lancashire to the fertile plains of Derbyshire. But the Duchy of Lancaster was no ordinary fief. It was designated as a county palatine, a medieval legal status granting its lord near sovereign powers within his lands. John could raise armies, collect taxes, and administer justice almost as if he were a king in the north. It was a power that would long outlive him. Even centuries later, the duchy remained distinct, its revenues flowing directly to the crown, a living echo of John of Gaunt. Yet Gaunt's influence was not confined to English soil. He was a warrior, diplomat, and statesman in equal measure, often described by contemporaries as the greatest prince not crowned. During the 1360s and 1370s, as his father's long war with France continued to ebb and flow, John became one of its principal commanders. His elder brother, Edward the Black Prince, blazed across the battlefields of France and Spain with unmatched ferocity. John, by contrast, fought longer, campaigned harder, and schemed deeper. In 1373, he led one of the most extraordinary military expeditions of the Middle Ages, a chevauchée, or mounted raid, that cut across the entire breadth of France. From Calais on the Channel coast, Gaunt's army rode more than 600 miles south to Bordeaux, slicing through hostile territory in a display of endurance and audacity that stunned Europe. Though strategically fruitless, the march proved John's iron will and cemented his reputation as a commander of immense resolve. But while his military ventures brought him fame, they also drained his fortune. The war, long and wearying, yielded few lasting victories. The Black Prince returned home sick and broken, dying in 1366 from what many believed to be dysentery. His young son, Richard, barely 9 years old, suddenly became heir to the throne. When King Edward III died the following year, England's crown passed to this fragile boy, Richard II, and the governance of the realm fell to his elders. John of Gaunt, as the child king's uncle, now found himself the most powerful man in England. He was no usurper, yet in many ways he ruled as one. His wealth dwarfed that of his peers, his influence stretched across Europe, and his confidence bordered on regal. He spoke with the authority of a sovereign, negotiated with foreign rulers as an equal, and often acted when the boy king could not. But John's ambitions reached beyond England. His first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, had died young in 1368, perhaps from the lingering shadow of the Black Death, which continued to stalk Europe. 3 years later, John remarried Constance of Castile, daughter of King Peter of Castile, who had been overthrown and murdered. Through this marriage, John claimed the title King of Castile and Leon. For years, he styled himself as such, adding the royal arms of Castile to those of Lancaster. In 1386, determined to make that claim real, he led an ambitious expedition to Spain. But the effort proved costly and futile. Spain was a furnace of shifting alliances and endless war. John's forces were exhausted long before his ambition was. He retreated through Portugal, his dream of a Spanish crown dissolving in the Iberian dust. By the time he returned to England in 1389, he was an older, wearier man, but his political instincts remained razor-sharp. He found his nephew Richard II in battle, mistrusted by his lords, and perilously close to the edge. Once more, John became the stabilizing force in a kingdom drifting toward chaos. Yet behind his composed exterior, a quiet storm was gathering, one that would echo across generations. Decades earlier, while still married to Blanche, John had employed a young woman from the Low Countries named Catherine Swynford. She served in his household, later becoming governess to his children. After Blanche's death, Catherine and John grew inseparable. Though married to another man, she became John's lifelong companion, and together they had 4 illegitimate children, given the surname Beaufort, a name drawn from one of John's French estates. For years, their relationship was whispered about, sometimes scorned, yet unbroken. When Constance of Castile died in 1394, John finally married Catherine 2 years later. With the king's approval, their children were legitimized, a seemingly small gesture that would one day change the course of English history. From this Beaufort line would descend Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, whose claim to the throne would rest on that single act of legitimization. By the final years of the 14th century, John of Gaunt had become a figure of immense gravity, respected, feared, and indispensable. He was the king's uncle, the realm's richest magnate, and the patriarch of a lineage that stretched toward the future like a drawn bowstring. He died in February 1399, quietly at Leicester Castle, his life spanning the golden age and gathering twilight of Plantagenet England. Yet his death left a void, a vacuum that his son, Henry Bolingbroke, would fill within months, not merely as Duke of Lancaster, but as King of England. The red rose of Lancaster was ready to bloom and soon to bleed. When John of Gaunt died in the early months of 1399, England held its breath. His passing marked the end of an era of chivalric splendor and noble ambition, but it also tore open a political fault line that had been long in the making. In theory, his estates, vast, fertile, and fiercely independent, should have passed to his eldest son, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford. But the reigning monarch, Richard II, saw danger where others saw inheritance. Fearing the immense power of the Lancastrian lands, Richard seized them for himself. It was a decision that would undo him. Henry, already exiled to France for having challenged another noble, learned of his father's death and the theft of his legacy while in exile. For a man of his stature, it was not merely a personal affront, it was an erasure. The blood of kings flowed in his veins, and he would not be denied what was his by right. In the summer of 1399, while Richard was in Ireland quelling rebellion, Henry returned to England. His landing was quiet, his purpose declared modestly, to reclaim his inheritance. But his march gathered momentum like a rolling storm. From the north and the Midlands, lords and soldiers flocked to his banner. The Lancaster colors, deep red and gold, became the symbol of renewal in a kingdom weary of Richard's capricious rule. The king's authority melted before him, his power rotted from within. When Richard hurried back from Ireland, he found his kingdom transformed. Castles that had once flown his standard now raised Bolingbroke's flag. Within weeks, the anointed monarch was a prisoner. What followed was unprecedented. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, the anointed of God, was forced to abdicate. Whether he was starved in captivity or quietly murdered at Pontefract Castle, his death in 1400 left the throne to the man who had taken it, Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king of England. But if Richard's downfall had been swift, Henry's rule would be a long and painful proving ground. From the moment he placed the crown upon his head, Henry's right to rule was questioned. Unlike his Plantagenet forebears, he was not heir by succession, but by conquest. Every sermon, every council, every act of parliament became a fragile dance around legitimacy. He had deposed a king, God's chosen, and medieval England had long memories for such sins. His reign began under a cloud of rebellion. In 1400, barely a year into his kingship, a Welsh lord named Owen Glyndwr rose in defiance. Once a loyal noble, Glyndwr claimed descent from the ancient princes of Wales and proclaimed himself Prince of Wales, a title lost since Edward I's conquest a century earlier. At first, it seemed a local quarrel between Welsh lords, but within months it had ignited into full-scale rebellion. The valleys and mountains of Wales blazed with resistance, and Glyndwr's charisma drew men from across the border. For 15 long years, his rebellion would haunt England's western frontier like a ghostly fire, its embers refusing to die even when its leader vanished into legend. Henry's throne shook again in 1403, when Sir Henry Percy, better known as Hotspur, turned his sword against the king he had once helped to crown. The Percys, lords of Northumberland, had been among Henry's earliest allies, but now they felt betrayed by his broken promises and unpaid debts. Hotspur, a fiery warrior adored by his men, raised his banners in open revolt. The clash came at Shrewsbury, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. There, beneath a sky heavy with smoke and thunder, the king's son, Prince Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V, fought beside his father. The young prince was struck in the face by an arrow, which pierced deep near his eye. He refused to leave the field, leading his men with the shaft still lodged in his flesh, until Hotspur himself fell, cut down in the chaos. The rebellion was crushed, but it left deep scars on the king and his kingdom. Even as his enemies fell, Henry IV found no peace. The rebellion of Glyndwr continued to simmer. The north remained restless, and the whispers of divine punishment grew louder. Some called his skin disease a mark of God's disfavor, a penance for the crime of dethroning a consecrated monarch. By 1405, his health had begun to fail. His body broke out in lesions, his limbs grew weak, and his spirit wavered between guilt and grim resolve. Some chronicles claim he suffered from leprosy, others from a chronic skin disorder or stroke. But all agreed on one thing: he was a man visibly wasting beneath the weight of his crown. It was said that when his illness worsened, he would lock himself away in the Jerusalem chamber, convinced by prophecy that he would die in Jerusalem. Whether through irony or divine design, he did die there, on March 20th, 1413, at the age of 45. By the end of his reign, the king who had seized a crown found himself its captive. His legitimacy, once contested by words, had been challenged by fire and steel. Yet somehow, through sheer endurance, the Lancastrian line had survived him. His eldest son, Henry of Monmouth, stood ready to inherit not only a kingdom, but a legacy, one forged in ambition, rebellion, and blood. The young man was everything his father had ceased to be: vibrant, decisive, and adored by his peers. During his father's long decline, he had already proven himself in battle and in statecraft. The scars on his face were a living testament to his valor. When the old king died, England mourned but also exhaled. A new dawn seemed possible. The prince who had fought in smoke and rain at Shrewsbury now wore the crown as King Henry V, a ruler destined, so it seemed, to restore England's glory abroad and its unity at home. But even as the bells tolled for the dead king, the ghosts of his rebellion still wandered the valleys of Wales, and in the quiet corners of the realm men whispered of prophecies, that the red rose of Lancaster, born from usurpation, would one day bleed for its crown. When Henry of Monmouth ascended the throne in the spring of 1413, England seemed to breathe again. After years of illness, rebellion, and uncertainty, a young, determined monarch now stood before his people, a man of action where his father had been a man of doubt. He was 26, tall and lean, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to burn through fog and fear alike. The arrow wound that had scarred his face at Shrewsbury had never fully healed. It cut across his cheek like a badge of endurance. To his subjects, this scar was more than a reminder of battle. It was proof of divine favor, a mark that their king had bled for England before he had ever worn its crown. Henry's first act as ruler was not to seek war, but to heal. He restored the honor of his father's enemies, reburied Richard II with royal dignity at Westminster, and called for unity across the fractured realm. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there was the heartbeat of a conqueror. Henry's vision extended beyond reconciliation. He sought to restore the glory of England abroad, to revive the ancient claim to the throne of France that had ignited the 100 Years' War. By 1415, with his kingdom pacified and the Welsh rebellion extinguished following the mysterious disappearance of Owen Glendour, Henry turned his gaze across the Channel. France was fractured, weakened by internal strife and the madness of its monarch, Charles VI. It was a moment of opportunity, and Henry seized it. In August 1415, he crossed the sea with an army of roughly 12,000 men, archers, knights, and common soldiers hardened by years of domestic strife. His banner bore the red rose of Lancaster, gleaming beneath the gray Norman sky. What followed would become one of the most celebrated campaigns in medieval history. After weeks of siege, Henry captured Harfleur, but at great cost. Disease ravaged his army, killing hundreds. Weakened and outnumbered, the king made a daring decision: to march his exhausted men north to the English-held port of Calais, deep through enemy territory. The French army, far larger and confident of victory, moved to intercept him. On October 25, 1415, the feast of St. Crispin, the two armies met near a small village called Agincourt. What followed was not merely a battle, but a legend. The French, numbering perhaps 3 times the English, advanced across rain-soaked fields thick with mud. Their armored knights, bogged down and disordered, became easy prey for the English longbowmen, who loosed clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. The sound of bowstrings snapped like thunder, the arrows cutting through armor and flesh. Henry fought among his men, his armor splattered with mud and blood, his voice rising above the chaos, not as a distant monarch, but as a soldier king. When the battle ended, the fields were strewn with thousands of French dead, including much of their nobility. The English losses were minimal. Agincourt was more than a victory, it was a resurrection. England, long divided and humiliated, now stood united behind a king who embodied its courage and faith. The poet Shakespeare, writing centuries later, would immortalize Henry's words, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." Yet behind the glory, Henry's vision was not of plunder or pride, but of permanence. He sought to conquer France outright, not merely as a raider, but as a rightful heir. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 seemed to make that vision real. Under its astonishing terms, King Charles VI of France recognized Henry as his heir and successor. Henry married Charles's daughter, the young Catherine of Valois, uniting the two royal houses in both blood and claim. For a moment, the dream of a dual monarchy, England and France under one crown, seemed within reach. In triumph, Henry returned briefly to England, his new queen by his side, and the realm erupted in celebration. Bonfires blazed from Dover to York. Ballads were sung of the warrior king who had humbled France and brought peace through strength. But destiny is never kind to those who grasp it too tightly. In 1421, Henry returned to France to quell renewed unrest. His queen, Catherine, remained behind and gave birth to their only son, Henry, born on December 6, 1421. The infant would never know his father. By the following summer, the king was dying. Weakened by exhaustion and illness, some said dysentery, others smallpox or the plague of heat that struck his camp, he took to his bed near Bois de Vincennes, just outside Paris. He was 35 years old, still in the prime of life, when death came for him on August 31, 1422. Those present later recalled his last words, a prayer for England, for France, and for the son who would inherit both crowns. It was a cruel irony that only 2 months later, Charles VI of France also died. Had Henry lived, he would indeed have become king of both realms, fulfilling the dream first conceived by his great-grandfather, Edward III, nearly a century earlier. Instead, that dream passed to a 9-month-old child, Henry VI, the third monarch of the House of Lancaster, too young to comprehend the weight of the crown placed upon him. In the great cathedrals of Europe, priests sang hymns for the warrior's soul. But in England and France, men whispered anxiously of the future. The mighty empire Henry had won by sword and treaty now hung by a thread. A kingdom led by a baby, governed by regents and surrounded by enemies waiting for the first sign of weakness. And as time would prove, weakness was exactly what they would find. For the glories of Agincourt would fade, and the name of Henry V, once sung by soldiers, would become a distant echo in a realm soon torn apart by madness, betrayal, and civil war. The warrior king had secured a crown in battle, but his heir would lose it in peace. When Henry VI was carried to the throne in 1422, England seemed, for a brief and brilliant moment, to stand at the pinnacle of its power. The kingdom had never been richer, nor its armies more feared. Its young king was heir to 2 crowns, England and France, the living embodiment of his father's triumph. But beneath that gilded promise lay a fatal truth. The crown rested on the head of a child barely 9 months old. And in the brutal world of 15th century politics, a child was both a symbol and an invitation, a symbol of innocence and an invitation to ambition. While the baby king gurgled in his cradle, the realm was ruled by regents. At the center of power stood Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, Henry IV's youngest son, who served as Lord Protector of England. Across the Channel, the French territories were governed by John, Duke of Bedford, a brilliant commander who fought to hold together the conquests Henry V had won. For a time, their partnership worked. The English still held Normandy, Aquitaine, Gascony, and the jewel of Paris itself. The banner of St. George flew proudly over lands that had been English for a generation. But without the iron will of Henry V, the unity he had built began to fray. The French crown, though shattered, was not dead. The Dauphin, the late Charles VI's son, now Charles VII, refused to accept the Treaty of Troyes. His claim was dismissed by the English as illegitimate, but in the countryside of France, his name began to stir hope. Then, in 1429, that hope took form in a figure so unlikely that even her enemies would call her miraculous. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Domremy, claimed to have received visions from God commanding her to drive the English from France. To the weary French, she was a divine messenger. To the English, she was a dangerous fanatic. In a matter of months, she lifted the siege of Orléans, turned the tide of war, and led Charles to his coronation at Reims. The English mocked her as a witch, but they could not mock their losses. Joan's fire rekindled France's spirit, and in 1431, when the English captured her, they burned her at Rouen marketplace. Her ashes scattered into the wind, but her legend would not die. For the House of Lancaster, the wind was shifting. By 1435, the English suffered another devastating blow. Their greatest ally, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, made peace with Charles VII through the Treaty of Arras. Deprived of Burgundian support, England's continental empire began to crumble. In the same year, the death of Bedford left the regency rudderless. The war dragged on, but its tide had turned irrevocably. French armies pushed the English back, retaking city after city. The dream of empire that Henry V had carved in blood was dissolving before the eyes of his son's guardians. By the time Henry VI came of age in 1437, the France his father had conquered was nearly lost. He had been crowned twice, once at Westminster as King of England and once at Notre Dame as King of France. But in truth, he ruled neither. Unlike his father and grandfather, Henry was no warrior. He was gentle, devout, and painfully unsuited to kingship. He preferred prayer to politics, charity to command. In an age that demanded strength, he offered piety. The nobles who surrounded him, fierce, ambitious men like Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, soon saw that the crown could be guided, even controlled. By 1440, the English position in France was collapsing. Normandy, once the pride of the English crown, was lost by 1449, and Bordeaux, the last great outpost of England's continental power, fell in 1453. The Hundred Years' War, which had begun in the glory of Edward III, ended in humiliation under his descendant. Only Calais remained, a lonely garrison on the French coast, a relic of an empire that had turned to dust. England, drained of wealth and pride, turned its anger inward. The people blamed Henry's government, and by extension, Henry himself. At court, faction consumed the realm. The Beauforts, descendants of John of Gaunt's legitimized line, held the king's favor and promoted peace with France. Opposing them was the faction of Richard, Duke of York, a man with both the blood of Edward III and a dangerous sense of destiny. York had once governed France and Ireland with competence and restraint, but he had been cast aside by Henry's advisors. He returned to England embittered, surrounded by supporters who saw him as the kingdom's last hope. Then, in 1453, fate dealt the House of Lancaster its most fatal wound. As news reached England of the catastrophic defeat in Bordeaux, the final loss of France, the king's fragile mind broke. He fell into a catatonic stupor, unresponsive to his courtiers, unable to speak or recognize even his own newborn son, Edward of Westminster, born that October. The king sat in silence while the realm tore itself apart around him. For more than a year, England was effectively leaderless. Power passed to the council, and eventually to the man many already saw as king in all but name, Richard, Duke of York. Appointed Lord Protector in 1454, York ruled efficiently, restoring order and trimming the excesses of the royal household. But when Henry suddenly recovered his senses in December that same year, the fragile balance collapsed once more. The Beaufort faction, led by Edmund Beaufort and Henry's indomitable queen, Margaret of Anjou, sought to remove York from power. Margaret, fierce and proud, became the true commander of the Lancastrian cause, determined to defend her husband's crown and her son's inheritance. The kingdom, exhausted by war and poisoned by faction, stumbled toward the inevitable. In 1455, armed conflict erupted at St. Albans. It was the first open battle of what would become known as the Wars of the Roses, named for the symbols of the two rival houses, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. The battle was brief but bloody. Somerset fell, Henry was captured, and York once again assumed control of the government. The Roses had drawn blood, and England would never be the same again. The century-long dream of English kingship, of one crown ruling both England and France, was over. In its place stood a broken monarch, a divided realm, and a question that would echo through the coming decades. Who was the true heir of Edward III? The saintly Henry of Lancaster, or the ambitious Duke of York? Above, rested in blood. The year was 1455, and England had crossed an invisible line. For decades, the rival branches of Edward III's descendants had plotted and whispered, but now the whispers were drowned by the clash of steel. At St. Albans, beneath the banners of red and white roses, the first blood of civil war had been spilled. The victory belonged to the House of York. Richard, Duke of York, emerged as the realm's de facto ruler, and for a brief moment it seemed as though order might return. But peace in those years was an illusion, a candle guttering in the wind. The king, Henry VI, though returned to his senses, was fragile, childlike, and easily swayed. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was fierce where he was meek, resolute where he was uncertain. And she would not forgive those who had humiliated her husband. In Margaret burned the will that Henry lacked. To her, York was not a protector, he was a usurper in waiting. She set about rebuilding the Lancastrian cause, gathering allies among the northern lords, and promising vengeance for the blood spilled at St. Albans. Years of uneasy peace followed. Broken truces, shifting alliances, and uneasy councils. By 1459, the truce had shattered entirely. The realm split down its spine. The north and west rose for Lancaster. The south and east rallied behind York. It was not merely a battle for a crown, it was a war for England's soul. The next years were chaos given form. At Ludford Bridge, the Yorkists fled the field. Their fortunes collapsed, and Richard himself fled to Ireland. Yet, even in defeat, the Yorkist cause refused to die. In the following summer of 1460, Richard's allies, including the powerful Earl of Warwick, soon to be called the Kingmaker, returned in triumph. They captured London, seized the king, and struck a bargain that shocked the realm. Henry VI, still king in name, was forced to agree that upon his death, the crown would pass not to his son, Prince Edward of Westminster, but to Richard of York and his heirs. To Queen Margaret, this was treason clothed in parchment. To the nobles of the north, it was blasphemy. Margaret fled to Scotland, gathering an army of loyalists who swore to avenge her son's stolen inheritance. In December 1460, her forces and York's met in the cold fields near Wakefield Castle. What followed was slaughter. Richard of York, the man who had claimed to be England's savior, rode out to face the Queen's army, and never returned. His banner fell, his standard-bearer cut down, his son Edmund slain beside him. York's head was taken, crowned mockingly with a paper diadem, and mounted upon the gates of York City. For a brief, bloody moment, the Red Rose had triumphed. But Margaret's victory was fleeting. Richard's mantle passed to his 18-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, tall, golden-haired, and as ambitious as he was charismatic. Within weeks, Edward gathered his father's supporters, crushed a Lancastrian force at Mortimer's Cross, and marched toward London, the wind of destiny at his back. At the same time, Warwick, the kingmaker, defeated another Lancastrian host at St. Albans, though the Queen and her child escaped northward. When Edward reached London, the city's gates swung open to him. The people, weary of Henry's weakness and Margaret's fury, hailed Edward as their deliverer. In March 1461, Parliament proclaimed him King Edward IV of England. For the House of Lancaster, it was a second fall, as sudden as the first when Henry Bolingbroke had overthrown Richard II. Only now the roles were reversed, and the Red Rose was withering under the shadow of white. But the Lancastrians were not finished. Queen Margaret was not a woman to yield her son's birthright to parchment or Parliament. She rallied her army once more, a northern host of thousands, and met the Yorkists on March 29, 1461, at Towton, a windswept plateau in Yorkshire. It was Palm Sunday. Snow fell thick and blinding, driven by wind into the faces of the Lancastrians. Beneath the white storm, red banners whipped in the gale. The Dragon of Cadwallader, the Rose of Lancaster, the Cross of St. George. Towton was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Tens of thousands clashed in the freezing mud, the roar of men and steel drowned only by the wind. The snow turned red. When it ended, the Lancastrian army was annihilated. Nobles fell beside common soldiers, and the bodies piled so high that rivers ran crimson for miles downstream. Henry, Margaret, and their young son fled north into Scotland, their cause shattered. Edward IV entered London in triumph that summer. Tall, confident, and ruthless, he was everything Henry VI was not. His crown was won by conquest, but unlike Henry IV, he wore it without apology. The Red Rose had been torn from the crown, but the House of Lancaster, battered and bleeding, still clung to life. Pockets of resistance flared in the north, in Wales, in the west. Even after Edward's victory at Hexham in 1464, where the last major Lancastrian force was destroyed, rebellion smoldered like ash in the wind. Henry VI, captured and broken, was taken to the Tower of London. There, the man who had once been king lived not as a prisoner of iron, but of silence, praying, mumbling, lost in his own mind. Edward spared him. Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps calculation. So long as Henry lived, the Lancastrian claim remained trapped behind stone walls. His heir, young Edward of Westminster, wandering in exile with his indomitable mother. For 5 years, Yorkist rule held firm. England was weary of blood. The markets of London bustled again, and the people began to forget the quiet, pious king whose weakness had once torn the country apart. But the wheel of fortune turns quickly in England. The Red Rose, though trampled, had not died, and fate was already weaving its threads toward another reckoning. By 1465, England seemed at peace again, at least on the surface. Edward IV, the young and handsome Yorkist king, sat securely upon the throne. The merchants of London toasted prosperity, and the long years of war appeared to fade into memory. But beneath the silk and ceremony, old loyalties still burned. The House of Lancaster was not yet a ghost, and the red rose had one last bloom left in it. In the Tower of London, Henry VI still lived, pale, silent, and half forgotten. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, had fled to France with their son, Edward of Westminster, the last hope of her line. For nearly a decade she pleaded at foreign courts for aid, her fiery will unbroken by defeat. She found an unexpected ally not among the French kings, but among her enemy's own. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man history would call the Kingmaker. Warwick had once been Edward IV's most powerful supporter. It was he who had secured Edward's throne, who had fought beside him at Towton, and who had crowned him in London. But kings, once made, grow willful, and Edward was no exception. He defied Warwick's counsel, married for love rather than politics, Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow whose family quickly rose in favor, and showered them with titles and lands that should have gone to Warwick's kin. To the proud earl, it was betrayal. His influence at court waned, and his resentment deepened into rebellion. In 1469, Warwick struck. Aligning with Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, he fomented uprisings across the realm. The rebellion faltered, but the trust between king and earl was shattered. By 1470, Warwick made an audacious choice. He turned to his old enemy, the exiled Queen Margaret. Their alliance was born of desperation and vengeance. Warwick would restore Henry VI to the throne. Margaret would reward him with power and pardon. And so, in a twist no chronicler could have foreseen, the architect of Yorkist victory became the general of the Lancastrian cause. That autumn, Warwick landed in England with a French-backed force. Edward, caught off guard, found his own army collapsing around him. Even his brother Clarence, ever the opportunist, betrayed him and joined Warwick's side. In a stunning reversal, Edward fled into exile across the Channel, just as his grandfather Henry Bolingbroke had once done, and England once more was upended. On October 3, 1470, Warwick entered London in triumph. The Tower gates swung open, and the weary, bewildered figure of Henry VI was led out to be crowned again. The chroniclers called it the readeption, the restoration of the Red Rose. The city rejoiced with bonfires and processions, but it was joy built on illusion. Henry, frail and childlike, was a king only in name. He smiled vacantly from his throne while Warwick ruled in his stead. Parliament reconfirmed Henry's rights, repealed Yorkist statutes, and issued proclamations as if 2 decades of blood had been erased. Yet, beyond the pageantry, the realm trembled. The nobles who had prospered under Edward IV seethed with fear. The merchants of London distrusted Warwick's alliance with France. And across the Channel, in the Low Countries, the exiled king was gathering his revenge. Edward IV was no longer the callow youth who had seized a crown in battle. He had matured, hardened by betrayal, driven by pride, and backed by the might of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. In March 1471, Edward landed once more on English soil with a small but disciplined army. At first, he claimed he sought only his dukedom, not his crown. But the lie fooled no one. One by one, cities opened their gates to him. His charisma, his confidence, and his cause drew men like iron to a lodestone. In early April, he reached London. Warwick's troops hesitated, and within days, Edward entered the city unopposed. Henry VI was quietly returned to the Tower, and the Red Rose began to wilt again. The reckoning came swiftly. On April 14, 1471, Edward met Warwick's army at Barnet, north of London, in a battle fought under thick fog and confusion. The fog turned friend against friend, banners vanished into mist. At dawn, Warwick's lines broke. The Kingmaker, the man who had made and unmade kings, was cut down as he fled. His body, stripped and bloodied, was displayed in London, a grim warning to all who would gamble with thrones. But one foe still remained. Queen Margaret had landed in the west with her son, Edward of Westminster, unaware that Warwick was already dead. The Queen pressed on, determined to unite with her remaining allies and reclaim the crown in her son's name. Edward IV, ruthless and relentless, marched to intercept her. On May 4, 1471, the two forces met at Tewkesbury. There, on a spring morning beneath the abbey's shadow, the final act of the Lancastrian tragedy unfolded. The battle was brief and brutal. The Lancastrian line broke under Edward's assault. Young Edward of Westminster, only 17, was slain. Some said in battle, others whispered by the king's own hand after surrender. Queen Margaret was captured, her spirit finally crushed. That night, the last hope of the Red Rose died with her son. In London, Henry VI remained in the Tower, a quiet, broken man who had once ruled both England and France. 10 days later, on May 21st, he too was dead. The official record claimed natural causes. Few believed it. Most whispered that Edward IV, unwilling to risk another rebellion, had ordered the final blow. With Henry's death, the House of Lancaster's direct line was extinguished. For the first time in decades, England was united under one king. But peace in that age was never more than an interlude. Edward's reign, though firm, was shadowed by intrigue, betrayal, and the ghosts of those he had destroyed. Yet the Red Rose of Lancaster, though torn from its stem, had not vanished from England's story. In the bloodlines of those who had once served John of Gaunt, in the legitimized Beauforts, whose distant descendant was a young Welshman named Henry Tudor, the embers of the house still smoldered. And when the White Rose of York began to devour itself, those embers would rise again to claim the crown in fire and union, in the name of both roses. When Henry VI died in the Tower of London in May 1471, the cell walls closed not only upon a man, but upon a dynasty. For nearly 3/4 of a century, the Red Rose of Lancaster had dominated English politics, rising from John of Gaunt's ambition, flourishing in Henry V's victories, and withering in the gentle hands of his son. Now it seemed gone forever, trampled beneath the white banners of York. Edward IV, triumphant and unchallenged, ruled with strength and shrewdness. The land, exhausted by decades of bloodshed, began to heal. The markets revived, the fields returned to harvest, and for a moment, England seemed whole. But peace in the 15th century was a fragile thing. It was not born of forgiveness, but of fear. And beneath the surface, the ghosts of Lancaster still murmured. One woman in particular carried its last embers, Margaret Beaufort. She was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, born of the legitimized Beaufort line. By blood, her claim to the throne was faint, even barred by law, but by fate it was destined to endure. Margaret had married a Welsh nobleman, Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. Their union, brief and tragic, produced a son, Henry Tudor, born in 1457, just as the Lancastrian cause began to crumble. When his father died of plague, Margaret was left a widow at 13, clutching an infant who, unbeknownst to the world, carried the last living claim of the House of Lancaster. During Edward IV's reign, young Henry lived in exile, shuttled across Brittany and France, a quiet ward of foreign kings, his name whispered only by those few who still remembered the Red Rose. He grew to manhood far from the realm his ancestors had ruled, watching from the shadows as England's Yorkist court devoured itself from within. For in the years that followed Henry VI's death, the House of York began to unravel. Edward IV's rule, though strong, was plagued by inner suspicion. His brother, George, Duke of Clarence, the same man who had once betrayed him to Warwick, plotted again. Edward had him executed in 1478, drowned, it was said, in a butt of Malmsey wine, a dark jest that history never forgot. Then, in 1483, Edward himself died suddenly, at 40, leaving his son Edward V, a boy of 12, to inherit a crown still haunted by old blood. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named protector of the realm, a loyal, capable man, or so many believed. But ambition, like rot, spreads unseen. Within weeks, Richard seized the throne for himself. The young Edward and his brother were taken to the Tower of London, ostensibly for safety. They were never seen again. The whispers grew into accusation. Richard had murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower. Whether true or not, it stained his reign before it began. England, once tired of war, now recoiled in horror. The White Rose of York, triumphant for a generation, was now red with guilt. And across the sea, in Brittany, Henry Tudor watched and waited. The exiled Welshman, quiet, cautious, and patient, had become the vessel of all hopes opposed to Richard's tyranny. His claim was tenuous, but his cause was righteous. The Beaufort blood gave him the mantle of Lancaster. The crimes of Richard gave him legitimacy in the eyes of God and man. In 1485, Henry crossed the Channel with a modest army, French mercenaries, exiled Englishmen, and fortune's faithful. He landed in Wales, where his father's bloodline still held sway among the hills and valleys. Local lords rallied to his banner, swelling his forces as he marched eastward. On August 22, 1485, at a field near Bosworth, the fate of England once again turned on the edge of a sword. The armies of King Richard III and Henry Tudor met under a low summer sun. Richard fought with reckless valor, leading his men from the front, his crown fixed upon his helm. In the chaos of battle, he saw Henry across the field and charged directly toward him, a final desperate bid to end the war in a single stroke. But destiny, once again, favored the exile. Richard was surrounded, unhorsed, and struck down, the last English king to die on the battlefield. When the dust cleared, his gilded circlet was found in the mud and placed upon Henry's head. As the trumpet sounded and the cry went up, "Long live King Henry VII," the red rose of Lancaster had risen from its grave. Yet Henry understood that the age of civil war could not survive another bloom of rivalry. His first act as king was not vengeance, but union. In January 1486, he married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. In her veins ran the white rose, in his the red. Their marriage bound together the two warring houses, creating a new symbol, the Tudor rose, red and white entwined. It was more than a marriage. It was the healing of a century's wound. From that union came a dynasty that would shape the modern world, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and the forging of England as a nation of kings, queens, and oceans. Yet beneath their glory lingered the memory of how it began, in betrayal, ambition, and blood. Though the House of Lancaster had died with Henry VI, its spirit lived on in the Tudors. The red rose, once a sign of rebellion and loss, became a royal emblem once again, but now tempered by the white, a symbol of balance after chaos. Centuries later, the Duchy of Lancaster, John of Gaunt's old estate, would remain part of the crown's private holdings, a quiet, enduring echo of the house that once ruled and fell. Its revenues still flow to the sovereign today, a thread of gold connecting modern Britain to the fiery days when roses were drenched in blood. The story of Lancaster is the story of power itself, born in ambition, undone by pride, and immortalized by the dream of unity that followed its fall. The red rose withered, but its petals colored a dynasty, and its thorns, long buried, still remind the crown of the price of kingship. Thank you very much for watching.